Okay, so we're picking up at the end of lesson 6. This is the last slide, and we had talked in our class last week about what oxidation and what reduction meant. I gave you a little acronym, Leo the Lion Says Gur, to help you remember that loss of electrons is oxidation. That's the L and the E and the O. And gain of electrons is reduction. That's the G and the E and the R. You could also use oil rig, which stood for oxidation is loss, reduction is gain. Now the idea here is that throughout photosynthesis and cell respiration, molecules are going to be oxidized and reduced, and that's how we're going to bring things basically from one step to the next. So, coenzymes are going to act like transports. In the video we just watched, they named some of these coenzymes, ferredoxin and plastoquinone QB. I don't care about the names. We're not going to worry about naming each of those structures. We're going to collectively refer to them as coenzymes. But there are molecules that will transport electrons and hydrogen ions around from different steps of photosynthesis and cell respiration onto the next one. Now you'll notice that I put the oxidized forms first. These are the molecules without hydrogen on them. So I mentioned last time that for us, anytime things are oxidized or reduced, it's not just electrons, but also hydrogen ions that we're gaining and losing. And that actually makes it a bit easier. It's a little more evident in the formula. An oxidized form doesn't have an H. An oxidized form can be reduced. That means it could gain an H. An oxidized form cannot be oxidized again. It already lost its hydrogen. So the first molecule is NAD, and then you'll see in brackets I put a P. That's because there are actually two varieties of this molecule. There's NAD positive and NADP positive. The one with the P is for photosynthesis. The one without the P is used in cell respiration. It's a nice little way to remember it. FAD positive is only used in cell respiration. We're not going to mention it when we talk about photosynthesis. But these are all molecules that can pick up hydrogen and take them somewhere else. So any of these, NAD, NADP, or FAD, could pick up a hydrogen and take it to another spot. The reduced forms have an H, at least one of them. So the reduced forms would be NADPH, NADH, and funnily enough, FADH2, that's not a typo, there actually are two of them. It doesn't mean anything different for us, that's just the formula that it is, and I wouldn't expect you to explain anything about that. But just notice that it has the two, or it has the H on it. Reduced forms can be oxidized. So since they have an H, they could lose it. They cannot be reduced again, they're already reduced. We would say that these reduced forms have reducing power. Usually in chemistry we talk about the ability to cause a reaction for some other molecule. Since these are reduced, they have a hydrogen. If they bring their hydrogen somewhere and give it to another molecule, that other molecule gets reduced. So these have reducing power because they could cause another molecule to be reduced if they gave away their hydrogen. One of the things I will ask you once we've talked about photosynthesis and cell respiration is, when does this molecule get reduced? When does this molecule get oxidized? I'm not going to make a list now because I think it makes more sense for me to show you that as we do each step. But I'm just going to put a little note here that in the long run, you should be able to tell me when a molecule gets reduced or oxidized. In other words, which step of photosynthesis or cell respiration it happens in. So that's the end of lesson 6. And I'll move on to lesson 7, which is the video that you saw about the chloroplast and the electrons. So lesson 7 is the first part of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is actually a whole bunch of reactions, not just one thing. So that's why it says photosynthesis reactions plural, because it's a big group of things that are happening all at the same time. So the first thing we'll do is just recap what is happening overall in photosynthesis. Like I mentioned, you need to know the reaction for photosynthesis. So you should be able to recognize that during photosynthesis, I take 6 molecules of CO2 gas, 6 molecules of H2O liquid. There is some sunlight kicking around, and I produce 6 molecules of oxygen gas and 1 molecule of glucose, which is C6H12O6 solid. Now the probability that I will ask you to just write the reaction from scratch is low, but I would ask you as part of a multiple choice, hey, which of these are the reactants? Which of these are the products for photosynthesis? So I'll just remind you, reactants, products. Now, like I said, photosynthesis is not one simple chemical reaction. It's actually a big group of reaction. And we're going to talk about it in 2 parts. We're going to talk about light-dependent reactions and light-independent reactions. So there's actually 2 things that are happening, 2 separate steps of photosynthesis, and each of them involves a whole bunch of little mini sub-steps. But there are 2 main sections. Light-dependent. This is the part of photosynthesis that produces oxygen. It also produces NADPH and ATP. And if you look up here, they're not even part of the overall reaction. And so sometimes people forget that ATP is actually made in photosynthesis. But like it says there, those 2 molecules get used up in the second reaction. And the second reaction is where glucose comes from. So there's your 2 products, and we know basically where each of them is coming from. Oxygen is going to come from the light-dependent reaction. Glucose is going to come from the light-independent reaction. And so that we can place them, here's another little picture of a chloroplast. You'll see it's generally an oval with some circles inside of it. The stacks here are the grana, just like it says. And we know that grana are made up of thylakoid membranes. In one of these stacks is where the light-dependent reaction happens. In the light-dependent reaction, what happens is that water goes in, just like it shows down here, and oxygen comes out. The light-independent reactions are happening not in the grana, they're happening in the stroma, the space. And in this portion, like it shows on the picture, CO2 goes in and glucose comes out. And then in between them, we see that that is where ATP goes. On my picture, it only shows hydrogen, but in the words, I wrote NADPH. And so I just want to remind you, NADP is just the transport for hydrogen. So it's just the H, really, that I care about, and that's why sometimes you just see the H and not NADPH. So this is basically what's happening in the whole process of photosynthesis. In the grana, which are made of thylakoids, light is required, water comes in, oxygen goes out. In the stroma, where light is not required, CO2 comes in, glucose comes out, and those two products I circled in blue, NADPH and ATP, that I made in the first part, get used up. So they're not in the overall reaction because I use them. Now, does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask about the reaction or about the two steps and what goes in and out of each of them? A question I would ask you, absolutely, would be to compare the two reactions. And even though today we'll only talk about the first step, the light-dependent reaction, this overview is a good study tool for comparing them. I showed you here that one needs light and one doesn't. One happens in the grana, the other in the stroma. One uses water, the other uses CO2. One produces oxygen, the other produces glucose. So you have four things that you could compare them on. Where they happen, whether or not they need light, what goes in, what comes out. Does anyone want to ask anything? So we have to talk about the light-dependent reaction first. The light-dependent reaction has a couple of names. Most of the time in your textbook they refer to it as the light-dependent reaction, but commonly, like in the science world, there are other things that we could call it. So part one, the light reaction, could also be known as photolysis or the light-dependent reaction. So any of those three names is acceptable to me if you want to talk about the first part of photosynthesis. Light reaction, photolysis, light-dependent reaction. I just want to key in on the word photolysis. Photo, anywhere you see it in a word, means light. So a photograph is a picture out of light. Lysis, we already saw, cuts or breaks, like hydrolysis was when water cuts. Photolysis is when using light is going to help cut something apart. In light-dependent reaction, it's the word dependent that's really key. This reaction depends on light. It cannot function without light. Now, where does it happen? It happens on the thylakoid membranes, and you could say the granum because that's a stack of thylakoid membranes inside the chloroplasts.